The video games industry is a tough one, and the harsh financial realities as a result of questionable decisions can make or break both individuals and entire companies. The default response to this is to look for work elsewhere. With a promising portfolio, a talented person can join a different, more solvent company. But there is another option entirely. Certain former employees decide to go into business for themselves, forming entirely new companies out of the ashes of their former ones, or simply splintering off from a surviving studio for other reasons less monetarily motivated. Here are 10 of the best PC game studios that I have played games from, who have come into being as a result of this newfound independence. Number 10. Telltale Games. LucasArts, formerly Lucasfilm Games, were one of the greatest games developers of all time for any system, and they made their first big splash in the point-and-click adventure genre. By 2004, the company was restructured and had stopped making adventure games altogether. It was that year that led to the departure of 3 of the team to form their own studio for that express purpose. Telltale's strategy was episodic digital releases of licensed adventure games, alongside various puzzle and card games. These were received positively, with the likes of Sam and Max and Wallace and Gromit fans appreciating new material from the comedic duos. By the early 2010s, the company had hit its peak, releasing the 1-2 punch of The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us, which were critically acclaimed. This success was a double-edged sword, as it locked them into developing an increasing number of large licensed projects with the exact same gameplay mechanics. The reliance on this formula and the crunch time used to create it was ultimately the company's demise. Also number 10, Double Fine Productions. What? You can't just insert yourself in there. Actually they can, as Double Fine were formed for exactly the same reason as Telltale from exactly the same company. LucasArts had shifted away from adventure games, and I'd already mentioned that. Someone had to do something about that. Tim Schafer was the man for the job, and proceeded to publish a platformer? Psychonauts was well received, and was followed up with an action-adventure RTS hybrid Brutal Legend, a party-based RPG, a puzzle game, a tower defense game. All were met with polite applause and financial reimbursement from fans of the company and investors alike. But none of this was what brought Schafer to the dance. Then 87,000 people on Kickstarter gave him money when he announced Broken Age, a crowd-funded adventure game and his first in the genre for over 15 years. It was broken into 2 acts, released at different times from each other. Double Fine remastered 3 of its classic adventure games. This pleased everyone. Then Microsoft bought them. We'll see how that goes. You'll be hearing this a lot. Number 9. Respawn Entertainment and Infinity Ward. That's right, another twofer. Remember Saving Private Ryan? Steven Spielberg wanted to make a game like that, so he got in touch with DreamWorks and the console shooter series Medal of Honor was born. Spielberg was still interested in the series and wanted a 3rd game developed. He got in touch with id Software about it. id told Steven Spielberg they were too busy, but said that 2015 games might be up for the task. The result was Medal of Honor Allied Assault, the first PC release and the first modern cinematic military shooter. A number of developers involved in the game were unhappy with EA, which isn't exactly surprising, so they jumped ship by forming Infinity Ward, with more than a small helping hand from publisher Activision. Licensing id Tech 3 from John Carmack's id Software, they created a cinematic military shooter of their own, and called it Call of Duty. That did rather well for itself, didn't it? But in order to get to that point, it needed some good games in the first place. And the first 3 titles developed by Infinity Ward are classic first-person shooters, no matter where the brand name ended up. Why not the later titles from the company? Because the original developers left Infinity Ward in 2010 to form Respawn Entertainment, a brand new start, a fresh new company that, sought funding from EA. The same EA they left in the first place. Titanfall, Apex Legends, Fallen Order, lots of modern day shooters that are critically acclaimed and loved by people far younger than me. They even made a new Medal of Honor game in virtual reality. Talk about coming around full circle. Number 8. Looking Glass Studios. Origin Systems released some of the best games ever for the PC. When they moved from New Hampshire to Texas, one of their developers was left with their studio, and most importantly, money. Paul Neurath formed Blue Sky Studios, hired an MIT programmer and a former Origin employee for the graphics and programming of this new game, and Origin were impressed with the tech demo he sent them, and gave them the Ultimate license to play with. After successfully releasing a game whose influence brought about the creation of both The Elder Scrolls and Doom, Blue Sky merged with Lerner Research, who had been working with them anyway. They proceeded to release a series of what are now known as immersive sims, first-person 3D environment games that encourage the player to think rather than just run and gun. While there were a series of successes, including the likes of Flight Unlimited and Thief, the company ran into major financial issues and closed their doors at the turn of the new millennium. Their legacy was carried on by former staff members working with the likes of Ion Storm to create Deus Ex, or forming studios like Irrational Games and Arcane, who produced Bioshock and Dishonored respectively. Number 7. Troika Games. Interplay are one of my favourite publishers of all time, and in 1997 they released Fallout. After finishing the design for the sequel, questions over the team structure meant that 3 of the main designers left to form a new studio called Troika Games. Troika released a steampunk RPG called Arcanum through Sierra Entertainment. It sold well, but was buggy. The Temple of Elemental Evil was a D&D dungeon crawler that sold considerably less copies, and was also criticised for being buggy. Seeing a pattern here? Licensing something called the Source Engine from Valve, Troika's third game was Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which sold even less copies, and was, you guessed it, buggy. In hindsight, releasing a Source-based first-person game on the exact same day as Half-Life 2 probably wasn't the best business decision. And that was it. Just 3 games. Troika went the way of the dodo the following year. Why are they on this list then? Because the 3 games they did release have basked in the retrospective hindsight of players, especially that final title. In a different world, Bloodlines would have been less buggy and sold more. Their 4th title, Van Buren, would have come into fruition, and Troika would have taken over the RPG gaming landscape. This did not happen, and they were outbid for a license by somebody called Bethesda Softworks. That license? The Fallout license. The rest is history, just like Troika, unfortunately. Speaking of which, number 6, Obsidian Entertainment. Troika weren't the only team to come out of the Fallout under Interplay, and members of the people who worked on the 2 titles and subsequent Dungeons & Dragons RPGs under the name Black Isle Studios became dissatisfied with Interplay after they lost a D&D license in the middle of a production of the 3rd Baldur's Gate game. Some of the top devs behind this cancelled title came together and formed Obsidian Entertainment. This was the 3rd large studio to be created in the wake of Fallout, following Troika and In Exile. The company were contacted by LucasArts to make a sequel to BioWare's Knights of the Old Republic, and they created The Sith Lords, a brilliant but rushed RPG riddled with bugs. Another BioWare sequel was well received, but had bugs. Why do I feel like I'm repeating myself? Alpha Protocol was the studio's first original title, and did not fare well critically or commercially. Obsidian had a reputation for outstanding writing but unpolished releases. Would they go the way of Troika? After releasing the best first-person RPG of all time in Fallout New Vegas, but narrowly missing out on financial bonuses due to the Metacritic score, Obsidian were forced into making layoffs in 2012. Dungeon Siege 3 did the company no favours, and while their licensed South Park RPG The Stick of Truth was a return to form, it only kept the wolf from the door for so long. Turns out Obsidian would have gone the way of Troika, but for something called crowdfunding, a new concept that Double Fine had used that allowed fans to pay upfront for games, and got to work on Project Eternity, which was renamed to Pillars of Eternity and kept the company afloat after its positive reception. 2018 was when Microsoft came calling for the company, and even after this acquisition, Obsidian are a shining example of how a Splinter company can survive thanks to crowdfunding. Number 5. Lionhead Studios. Peter Molyneux is a complex individual, and another great developer who became unhappy with EA. Prior to the takeover, Bullfrog Entertainment had released a series of classics in various genres, but were perhaps best known for their fantastic strategy titles. He left in 1997 and formed Lionhead Studios, fronting the company with $6 million of his own money, then had the audacity to get in touch with EA and secure a publication deal for the resulting game. Black and White was a mega hit. A god game where your disembodied hand controlled a monstrous avatar. Action RPG Fable was also a massive hit, and it seemed like Lionhead could do no wrong. Until they did. Black and White 2 didn't live up to expectations. But quirky business sim The Movies was very fun to play back in 2005. What neither game managed to do was foot the bill. The company suffered financial issues, so predictably, Microsoft came calling. And that was the beginning of the end. Lots of staff leaving, no new titles outside of Fable, and the inevitable decline and dissolution of a company that had started so brightly. Number 4. Volition. Volition are an interesting case, in that they're technically not a Splinter company, but instead the result of Parallax Software Corporation splitting in two. Parallax became famous for one game series, and never released anything else. That game? Descent. A 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter that was one of the best things you could use your joystick for back in 1995. After a successful sequel, half the team moved to Ann Arbor to form a second office for the company, but came to the eventual conclusion that it was a bad idea to work remotely on the same game. They couldn't decide where to base their operations, so instead acrimoniously split into two separate entities. One company was called Outrage Entertainment, the other was the renamed Parallax, now going under the Volition name. Descent was only one of the best ways to use a joystick, because Telltale Games and their Star Wars space sims existed. Inspired by their greatness, Volition crafted Free Space, and followed it up with Free Space 2, possibly the best in the genre, other than TIE Fighter. Sales did not agree, and shortly after they were acquired by THQ, and could no longer publish Free Space or Descent games. Action RPG Summoner was their first effort, followed by FPS Red Faction, which had been repurposed from their Descent 4 efforts. The sequels developed for both games failed to make much of an impact, much like their licensed Punisher title. Then came Saints Row, a parody of the popular Grand Theft Auto series from Rockstar, and a fantastic third-person open-world series in its own right. Red Faction was revisited in third person in Red Faction Guerrilla, and Saints Row the Third in particular was universally praised. Founder Mike Kulas retired, and THQ filed for bankruptcy the year after. The company's still going strong under Deep Silver, but even with Kulas' return in 2019, it hasn't been the same since. Number 3. Faraxis Games. Microprose had developed a list of games in the 80s and 90s that was the envy of the world. In 1993 they merged with Spectrum Holobyte, and many jobs were lost in the years to come. Dissatisfied with this, Faraxis Games was born in 1997, with a focus on the strategy side of things. Gettysburg was their first release, and this real-time wargame fared well. Alpha Centauri in '99 is still considered one of the best 4X turn-based strategies ever made. This acclaim continued, release after release, and Faraxis soon established a reputation for excellence, culminating in their greatest achievement, Civilization 4. So predictably, you already know what happens next. Take-Two Interactive purchased the intellectual property of Infogrames and then acquired Faraxis outright. But unlike previous acquisitions, where the general quality of the games slipped, Faraxis under 2K Games continued to deliver smash hits, like Civilization 5 and XCOM Enemy Unknown. And while they might not have the luster that they once boasted, Faraxis continues to thrive. Number 2. id Software. Softdisk were a company that specialised in game discs mailed out with their monthly magazine in the 80s. One of their programmers convinced them to publish a PC game disc called Gamer's Edge. Had they known exactly what was happening in those offices, Softdisk would have thrown all the money in the direction of these developers. Gamer's Edge consisted of John Romero, John Carmack, Adrian Carmack, and Tom Hall, known collectively by every DOS gamer in the world a mere year later as id Software. The men who would become id started publishing their games through Apogee too, starting with the successful platformer series Commander Keen. Then came Wolfenstein 3D, whose shareware sales at Apogee propelled the company into self-publication, with their next title, which would take over the world, Doom. And the rest, as they say, is history. Well documented history in fact. You don't need this YouTube video to tell you what happened next. Number 1. Valve. id Software's Doom was ported to Windows 95 in order to make Windows seem like a viable gaming platform. A ludicrous statement in this day and age, but one that was necessary back then. The man for the task? A 12-year Microsoft employee called Gabe Newell. The port was a success, and got Newell into thinking about making a first-person shooter of his own. There was no Microsoft Games division at the time, and fellow Microsoft employee Michael Abrash had left the company to work on Quake. So why not Newell as well? Instead of joining id, Newell and Mike Harrington left Microsoft and formed their own studio. They developed a first-person shooter with a modified version of the Quake engine, and changed history. Half-Life was a linear, scripted, narrative-heavy first-person shooter that played like one long level, with the occasional load screen. Most PC gamers have either seen it, played it, or heard about it, by reputation alone. But Gabe wasn't done. Creating Steam, and both popularising the digital distribution platform and changing how the world acquired games completely. In addition to expansion contracts given to Gearbox Studios, Valve were keen on hiring Quake and Half-Life mod developers onto the team, and remaking their mods as games outright. This led to the release of Team Fortress, Ricochet, Deathmatch, Day of Defeat, and the mega-hit multiplayer shooter Counter-Strike. By the time they released Half-Life 2 and Portal in the Orange Box compilation with Team Fortress 2, they had become a behemoth, and slowly transitioned from games development into services. The company is now worth $8 billion as of 2021. If only Microsoft had produced their game studio label a few years sooner. Who knows what the gaming landscape might have looked like, and who knows about the impact of the Splinter companies that are yet to appear.